Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
The gavel crashes down. 6 years. My little brother Brandon stares straight ahead as handcuffs click around his wrists. Behind me, Mom's voice cuts through the courtroom like a blade. He's lying! Timothy has always been jealous. She's pointing at me, tears streaming, convinced I orchestrated this whole nightmare. The judge, the lawyers, everyone turns to look. 28 years old, and I'm still the family scapegoat. But this time, I didn't plant the evidence that destroyed Brandon. I just refused to help him hide it anymore. 3 months earlier, I walked into Sullivan Family Construction's main office, watching Brandon charm a potential client, while I prepared for another 14-hour day in the field. The sight was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Brandon, 25 and blessed with Dad's natural charisma and Mom's striking good looks, stood behind the mahogany desk that Dad had promised would be his someday. Meanwhile, I grabbed my hard hat and steel-toed boots, ready to oversee the actual construction work that made Brandon's promises reality. Dad built Sullivan Construction from absolutely nothing. 43 years ago, Robert Sullivan borrowed $1,500 from his brother and started laying foundations in our small Ohio town. Today, the company pulls in $3 million annually, employs 42 people, and has built half the commercial buildings in 3 counties. Dad's pride in what he created runs deeper than the concrete foundations we pour, and his dream has always been simple: pass the legacy to his sons. But in Dad's vision, we each had clearly defined roles. Brandon would be the face of the company, the charmer who could convince anyone to sign a contract. I would be the backbone, the reliable workhorse who made sure every project finished on time and under budget. It wasn't a partnership of equals. It was a hierarchy, and I accepted my place in it because I genuinely loved my family. The evidence of Brandon's favored status surrounded me every morning. His corner office overlooked Main Street, complete with leather chairs and a coffee machine that cost more than I made in a week. The company credit card lived permanently in his wallet, funding client dinners at expensive restaurants downtown. His brand new Ford F-250, painted Sullivan Construction blue with his name embroidered on the seat, sat in the reserved parking spot closest to the building. My morning routine started at 6 a.m. in the warehouse, checking material deliveries and coordinating with crew chiefs. By the time Brandon rolled in around 10, usually carrying Starbucks and wearing clothes that cost more than my monthly rent, I had already solved 3 problems and prevented 2 potential delays. He would flash that $1,000,000 smile, pat me on the shoulder, and say something like, "Thanks for holding down the fort, big brother. What would I do without you?" The inequality wasn't subtle, and it wasn't accidental. When Brandon got his second DUI 3 years ago, Mom and Dad hired the best lawyer in the county and paid $12,000 in legal fees. When I asked for a week off to visit Sarah's family in Colorado, Dad refused because someone responsible needs to mind the store while Brandon handles the Morrison account. Mom's favoritism burned brightest. Patricia Sullivan had wanted daughters to spoil, but got 2 sons instead. She poured all her frustrated maternal energy into Brandon, treating him like the golden child she could dress up and show off. His apartment downtown, with its exposed brick walls and city views, was decorated with furniture she bought. His refrigerator stayed stocked with groceries she delivered weekly. Meanwhile, my apartment near the job sites came furnished with whatever I could afford from garage sales and thrift stores. The business structure reinforced our roles perfectly. Brandon handled sales and client relations, the glamorous side where handshakes sealed $1,000,000 deals. I oversaw actual construction, which meant rising before dawn, spending days covered in sawdust and concrete dust, and dealing with angry clients when materials arrived late or weather-delayed projects. Our accounting was handled by Meridian Financial Services, an outside firm that sent monthly reports Dad barely glanced at as long as the bottom line stayed black. Brandon's lifestyle reflected his position. Expensive suits hung in his closet like works of art. His BMW lease cost more per month than most people's mortgages. Weekend trips to Chicago, Miami, or Las Vegas appeared regularly on his social media, always with beautiful women and expensive restaurants. He lived like someone who expected wealth, someone who had never questioned whether he deserved it. My life looked different. My 12-year-old pickup truck had 200,000 miles and a temperamental transmission. My apartment was clean and functional, but hardly impressive. The money I managed to save went into a modest account that I hoped would someday become an engagement ring for Sarah. She was a nurse at County General, practical and honest, someone who saw through my family's dynamics with uncomfortable clarity. Sarah understood what I was too loyal to admit. The setup wasn't fair, and it wasn't sustainable. She would watch Brandon waltz into family dinners empty-handed while I brought flowers for Mom and helped Dad fix whatever needed fixing around their house. She saw how my shoulders tensed when Mom praised Brandon's latest sales success while barely acknowledging that I had finished another project ahead of schedule. But I accepted it all because I believed in something bigger than fairness. I believed in family. Dad had built something remarkable from nothing, and Brandon and I were supposed to continue that legacy together. My role might be less glamorous, but it mattered. Someone had to ensure the quality that kept clients coming back. Someone had to maintain the reputation that Brandon's charm had helped build. The day everything changed started like any other. I arrived at 6 a.m. to find a delivery truck idling outside the warehouse. The driver, a guy named Pete, who had been delivering materials to us for 8 years, looked confused as he checked his paperwork against our latest order. "Hey Timothy," Pete called out as I unlocked the warehouse door. "I got a weird situation here. This invoice says I delivered 3 pallets of premium hardwood flooring to the Riverside Medical Complex 2 weeks ago, but my delivery logs don't show any hardwood going there. In fact, I don't show any deliveries to that site in the past month." I took the paperwork, expecting to find a simple mistake. Instead, I found something that made my stomach drop. The invoice was legitimate, Sullivan Construction letterhead, signed by Brandon, for $23,000 worth of premium oak flooring that had never been delivered to any job site. "Must be a mix-up in the paperwork," I told Pete, but my voice sounded strange even to me. "Let me check our records and get back to you." After Pete left, I stood in the warehouse surrounded by the familiar smell of sawdust and machine oil, staring at an invoice that didn't make sense. $23,000 was real money, even for a company our size. Materials that expensive didn't just disappear into thin air. I spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing delivery logs with invoices, checking job site records against purchase orders. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. The Riverside Medical flooring was just the beginning. Premium tile for the Henderson office building that never arrived. Custom cabinetry for the new bank branch that existed only on paper. High-end fixtures for the Morrison account that Pete had no record of delivering. By 9 a.m., I had identified $47,000 worth of materials that had been paid for but never delivered. My hands shook as I rechecked the numbers, desperate to find a mistake in my calculations. But the math was simple and terrifying. Someone was stealing from Sullivan Construction, and the trail led directly to Brandon's signature on every fraudulent invoice. I stared at the invoices spread across my desk, hoping that somehow the numbers would rearrange themselves into innocence. They didn't. $47,000 in phantom deliveries, each one bearing Brandon's confident signature, each one representing a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. My first instinct was denial. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Brandon had arranged for materials to be stored at an alternate location. Maybe there was a paperwork mix-up between job sites. Maybe the delivery company had made mistakes in their record-keeping. I clung to these possibilities, like a drowning man grabs driftwood. I drove to every job site on the invoices. At Riverside Medical, the foreman, Jake Martinez, confirmed that no hardwood flooring had ever been delivered. "We've been waiting on those floors for 3 weeks, he said, frustration evident in his voice. "Brandon keeps telling us they're back-ordered, but the clients are getting antsy." The Henderson office building told the same story. The premium tile that cost $18,000 existed only in our accounting system. The site manager, Carol Webb, showed me the cheap ceramic tiles they had been forced to use instead. Brandon said there was a delay with the original order, so we had to make do with these. The clients weren't happy about the downgrade. Each job site visit hammered another nail into the coffin of my hopes. The materials had been paid for, invoiced properly, but never delivered. And Brandon, charming Brandon, had been feeding everyone stories about delays and back orders, while the money disappeared into accounts I couldn't trace. Back at the office, I expanded my investigation. What I found made my initial discovery look like pocket change. The theft had been going on for 18 months, growing more sophisticated and brazen over time. Early incidents involved small overcharges, a few $100s here and there. But recent months showed a dramatic escalation. $5,000 discrepancies, $10,000 phantom deliveries. The pattern suggested someone who was either getting desperate or getting greedy. The total amount stole my breath away. $87,000. Nearly $90,000 stolen from the company Dad had spent 4 decades building. Money that should have gone to employee bonuses, equipment upgrades, or the expansion Dad had been dreaming about for years. Brandon's recent lifestyle changes suddenly made horrible sense. The expensive dinners I had attributed to successful sales meetings. The weekend trips to Las Vegas that Mom proudly posted about on Facebook. The new apartment downtown with rent that should have been impossible on his official salary. The BMW lease that cost more per month than most people made in a week. I thought about Dad's recent comments about cash flow problems, his worried frowns when reviewing monthly statements, his decision to postpone purchasing the new excavator he had been excited about for months. While Dad struggled to understand why profits were lower than expected, his younger son was living like a millionaire on stolen money. The evidence was overwhelming, but my heart refused to accept it. This was Brandon, the little brother I had taught to ride a bike, the kid I had protected from schoolyard bullies, the young man who still called me when he needed advice about anything important. There had to be another explanation. I decided to talk to Sarah before confronting anyone. She was working the evening shift at County General, and I met her in the hospital cafeteria during her dinner break. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and sterile, matching how I felt inside. "You look terrible," Sarah said the moment she saw me. "What's wrong?" I showed her the invoices, the delivery records, the calculations that painted Brandon as a thief. Sarah's nursing background had trained her to see patterns and analyze data, and she reached the same conclusion I had been trying to avoid. "Timothy, this isn't a mistake," she said gently. "This is systematic theft. Brandon has been stealing from your family for over a year. There has to be an explanation," I insisted. "Maybe he borrowed the money and plans to pay it back. Maybe there's some business strategy I don't understand." Sarah took my hands across the cafeteria table, her touch grounding me in reality. "Honey, look at the evidence. This isn't borrowing, this is theft. And if you don't do something about it, your dad's business could be destroyed." She was right, and I knew it. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two entirely different things. Brandon wasn't just my business partner or my coworker. He was my little brother, the kid I had always protected, the family member I would have trusted with my life. "I have to give him a chance to explain," I finally said. "I have to approach him directly before I involve Mom and Dad. Maybe there's something I don't understand." Sarah squeezed my hands tighter. "Be careful, Timothy. People who steal this much money don't usually confess and apologize. They get defensive. They get dangerous." I spent Thursday night planning what I would say to Brandon. I rehearsed conversations in my head, trying to find words that would give him room to explain, while making clear that the theft had to stop immediately. I practiced scenarios where he broke down and confessed, where he had a reasonable explanation, where we could fix this together without destroying our family. Friday morning, I did more research. I discovered that Brandon had been using the company credit card for personal expenses for over 2 years. Dinners that had nothing to do with business, hotel rooms for personal vacations, purchases at high-end clothing stores and jewelry shops. The company American Express statement read like a personal wish list rather than business expenses. I also found irregularities in his expense reports. Mileage reimbursements for trips that made no geographic sense. Hotel expenses for conferences that didn't exist. Business dinners with clients who weren't actually clients, just friends Brandon was impressing with company money. The pattern was clear. Brandon had been treating Sullivan Construction like his personal piggy bank, taking whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it. The phantom material deliveries were just the latest and most sophisticated evolution of a long-term plan to steal from his own family. By Friday afternoon, I had documented everything. Copies of invoices, delivery records, credit card statements, expense reports. The evidence filled a manila folder that felt heavy with more than just paper. It carried the weight of broken trust, shattered illusions, and the potential destruction of everything Dad had built. I called Brandon and arranged to meet him at his apartment at 7 p.m. He sounded surprised, but pleased to hear from me, suggesting we grab dinner afterward and catch up like we used to do. His casual friendliness felt like salt in an open wound. "Sure, big brother," he said cheerfully. "It'll be good to spend some time together. Feel like we haven't really talked in months." As I drove to his apartment that evening, I held on to one final hope, that Brandon would have an explanation that made everything okay. That somehow, the evidence I had collected would turn out to be a misunderstanding, that my little brother wasn't really a thief who had been systematically destroying our family's business. I parked outside his building and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, carrying my folder of evidence like it was radioactive. I knocked on his door, still hoping for a miracle. Brandon opened the door with his usual bright smile, but something was wrong. Behind him, I could see suitcases open on his bed, clothes scattered around his apartment like he was packing in a hurry. On his coffee table, stacks of cash sat next to what looked like travel documents. "Hey Timothy," he said, but his voice sounded strained. "Actually, this might not be the best time. Can we reschedule for next week?" That's when I saw the Costa Rican passport sitting next to the money, and I knew that my worst fears were about to come true. "Going somewhere?" I asked, pushing past Brandon into his apartment. The scene before me looked like something from a crime movie. Cash bundled with rubber bands, a fake passport with Brandon's photo but a different name, and airline tickets to San Jose, with a departure time of 11 p.m. Brandon closed the door behind me, his cheerful mask finally slipping. "It's not what it looks like, Timothy." "Really?" "Because it looks like you're planning to disappear with a bunch of stolen money." I set my folder of evidence on his kitchen counter, watching his eyes follow the movement. "We need to talk about some invoices, Brandon. Starting with $87,000 in materials that were never delivered to any job site." For a moment, Brandon said nothing. He stood there, in his expensive shirt and designer jeans, looking like a stranger wearing my little brother's face. Then he laughed, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. "You always were thorough, Timothy. Dad's little accountant, always checking and double-checking everything." He walked to his living room window, looking down at the street like he was calculating escape routes. "How long have you known?" "Since Wednesday." "The question is, how long have you been planning this?" Brandon turned back to me, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Calculation. Cold, careful calculation of how much he could get away with and what it would cost him. "You want the truth? Fine. I've been taking money from Sullivan Construction for 2 years. Not borrowing, Timothy. Taking. Because I've been building that client base, I've been bringing in the big contracts, and Dad pays me like I'm some entry-level salesman." The casual admission hit me like a physical blow. No shame, no remorse, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement of theft from his own family. "So you decided to steal from Dad? From the company he spent 40 years building?" "I decided to take what I've earned," Brandon shot back, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what I'm worth to this company?" I brought in the Morrison account. I landed the Riverside Medical contract. I've generated over $2 million in new business in the past 18 months alone. And you thought that justified stealing nearly $100,000? Brandon laughed again, the sound making my skin crawl. 100,000? Timothy, you really aren't as thorough as I thought. The materials are just the tip of the iceberg. I've been skimming from client deposits for 6 months. The real number is closer to 150,000. The room seemed to spin around me. $150,000. Nearly 3 years of my salary, stolen from our family business. Money that represented Dad's retirement fund, Mom's security, the futures of 42 employees who depended on Sullivan Construction for their livelihoods. The client deposits? I managed to whisper. Henderson Industries paid $60,000 upfront for their office complex. Riverside Medical put down $45,000 for their expansion. The Morrison account deposit was $38,000. Easy money, Timothy. They write the checks to Sullivan Construction, but they end up in accounts that only I control. I felt sick. Those are projects that start construction next month, when they find out the money is gone. That's the beauty of it, Brandon said, walking back to his suitcase and continuing to pack. I'll be in Costa Rica by then. No extradition treaty, beautiful beaches, and enough money to live very comfortably for a very long time. You're going to destroy Dad's business. 40 years of work, and you're going to destroy it all. Brandon stopped packing and looked at me with something that might have been pity. The business will survive. Dad will have to take out loans to cover the missing deposits, maybe mortgage the house, but he'll figure it out. He always does. And what about the family? What about Mom and Dad when they find out what you've done? That's where you come in, big brother. Brandon's voice took on a manipulative tone I recognized from childhood, the same voice he had used to talk his way out of trouble 1,000 times. You could keep quiet for 48 hours. Give me time to get settled in Costa Rica, then I'll wire the money back. All of it, plus interest. I stared at him in disbelief. You're lying. I'm offering you a solution. Nobody gets hurt, the money comes back, and I get a fresh start somewhere warm. Nobody gets hurt? Brandon, you've already hurt everyone. Dad's been losing sleep over cash flow problems that you created. Mom's been worried about Dad's stress. The whole family is suffering because of what you've done. Brandon resumed packing, his movements quick and efficient. The family will be fine. They've always been fine. Mom and Dad have you to take care of them. Reliable Timothy, always there to clean up everyone else's messes. The dismissive tone in his voice ignited something in me that I had kept buried for 28 years. All the times I had covered for him, all the times I had accepted less so he could have more, all the years of being the responsible one while he got to be the favorite. I'm not covering for you this time, Brandon. I'm calling Dad right now, and then I'm calling the police. I reached for my phone, but Brandon moved faster than I expected. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. You're not calling anyone, Timothy. You know why? Because I've already thought of that possibility. He let go of my wrist and walked to his computer, opening a folder on the desktop. See, while you were playing detective this week, I was being proactive. I've prepared a little insurance policy. On the screen were documents that made my blood run cold. Invoices with my forged signature. Bank account statements showing deposits to an account bearing my name. Credit card records showing the company American Express being used for my supposed personal expenses. You framed me. I prepared for the possibility that you might try to blame me for your own theft, Brandon said calmly. These documents show a pattern of embezzlement going back 2 years. Your signature, your accounts, your expenses. If you try to accuse me of anything, I'll be forced to reveal that I've been covering for you all this time. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't speak. This wasn't a desperate decision made in a moment of panic. This was a long-term plan to systematically steal from our family and frame me for the crime. You've been planning to destroy me from the beginning. I've been planning to protect myself. You always were jealous of my success, Timothy. Mom always said so. If you try to bring me down, everyone will believe that jealousy finally drove you to steal from the family business. Brandon closed the laptop and put it in his suitcase. Here's what's going to happen. I'm getting on a plane in 3 hours. You're going to go home and forget this conversation ever happened. Monday morning, you're going to show up at work like nothing happened. When the missing deposits are discovered in a few weeks, you'll act surprised and supportive while Dad figures out how to cover the shortfall. And if I don't? Brandon smiled, and for the first time in my life, I was genuinely afraid of my little brother. If you don't, I'll be forced to turn over evidence showing that you've been embezzling from Sullivan Construction for 2 years. Your signature is on dozens of fraudulent invoices. Bank records show deposits to accounts in your name. Who do you think Mom and Dad will believe? Their golden child who tried to protect them from the truth, or their jealous older son who finally snapped. I looked around his apartment one last time, taking in the expensive furniture, the designer clothes, the trappings of a lifestyle funded by stolen money. This was who Brandon really was. Not the charming favorite son, but a calculating thief who would destroy his own family to get what he wanted. I won't help you destroy Dad's business. Then you'll destroy yourself instead. Your choice, Timothy. But either way, I'm getting on that plane. I left his apartment with my folder of evidence, knowing that everything I had discovered was worthless. Brandon had outmaneuvered me completely, prepared for every possibility except one. He hadn't considered that I might be willing to sacrifice everything to stop him. As I drove home, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let Brandon disappear with stolen money, and I wasn't going to let him frame me for his crimes. Whatever the cost, I was going to expose the truth. I just had no idea how high that cost would turn out to be. Monday morning felt like walking into my own execution. I arrived at Sullivan Construction at my usual 6 a.m., hoping to have time to prepare before facing my parents. Instead, I found Dad's truck already in the parking lot, along with Mom's sedan. The lights were on in the main office, and through the windows, I could see 3 figures huddled around Dad's desk. My stomach dropped as I recognized the scene. This wasn't an early morning planning session. This was an intervention, and I was the target. I walked through the front door to find Mom, Dad, and Brandon arranged like a tribunal. Mom sat in one of the client chairs, her face red and blotchy from crying. Dad stood behind his desk, looking older than I had ever seen him. And Brandon sat casually in the corner, wearing a perfectly pressed shirt and an expression of sorrowful concern. "Timothy," Dad said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We need to talk." "Brandon told us everything," Mom said before I could respond. Her voice shook with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "How could you do this to your own family?" I looked at Brandon, who met my gaze with calm confidence. He had beaten me here, delivered the first version of events, and positioned himself as the reluctant whistleblower rather than the actual thief. "What exactly did Brandon tell you?" "He told us about the missing money," Dad said. "About the invoices you've been forging. About how he discovered what you were doing and tried to help you cover it up." Brandon leaned forward in his chair, his face a masterpiece of false concern. "I kept hoping you would stop, Timothy. When I first noticed the discrepancies, I thought maybe it was just a one-time thing, financial pressure or something. So I tried to cover for you, rearrange some accounts to hide the shortfalls. But it kept getting worse," Mom added, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Brandon said you were taking more and more money. He was running out of ways to protect you. I felt like I was drowning in quicksand. Every word I spoke seemed to sink me deeper into Brandon's carefully constructed lie. That's not what happened. Brandon is the one who's been stealing money. I have evidence." "Evidence?" Brandon's voice carried just the right note of hurt confusion. "Timothy, I know this is hard to admit, but trying to blame me isn't going to help anyone." He reached into a briefcase and pulled out a folder that looked sickeningly familiar. "I've been documenting everything, hoping I could find a way to make this right without involving Mom and Dad. But the evidence is overwhelming." Brandon spread documents across Dad's desk with the precision of a prosecutor. Invoices bearing my forged signature, bank statements showing deposits to an account with my name, credit card records showing the company American Express used for personal expenses that I had never made. "This account was opened 2 years ago," Brandon explained to our parents, pointing to bank statements. "Look at the deposit pattern. Every time money goes missing from a job site, an equivalent amount shows up here within days." Dad picked up one of the bank statements, squinting at the numbers. "Timothy Michael Sullivan. This is definitely your account." "I've never seen that account in my life," I protested. "Brandon created it using my information." "Why would I do that?" Brandon asked, his voice perfectly calibrated to sound both hurt and confused. "Timothy, I've been trying to protect you. When I found out what you were doing, my first instinct was to help you fix it quietly." Mom stood up abruptly, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "Don't you dare try to blame your brother for your mistakes. Brandon has been trying to save this family from the shame of what you've done." Look at the signatures, I said desperately. Compare them to my real signature. You'll see they're forgeries. Brandon sighed heavily. Timothy, handwriting analysis isn't going to help you here. People's signatures change over time, especially when they're under stress or trying to hide something. Dad was examining the invoices now, his face gray with devastation. These are definitely company letterhead. The amounts match our accounting records. Timothy, how long has this been going on? I haven't stolen anything. This is all Brandon's setup. He's been planning to disappear to Costa Rica with the money, and he's framing me to cover his tracks. Costa Rica? Mom's voice rose to near hysteria. Now you're making up stories about Brandon? This is exactly what he said you would do. He said you were so consumed with jealousy that you would try to destroy him rather than admit your own guilt. Brandon stood up and walked to where I was standing, putting what looked like a supportive hand on my shoulder. Timothy, I know you're scared. I know admitting this is the hardest thing you'll ever do. But continuing to lie is only making things worse. I shrugged away from his touch, but the damage was done. To my parents, it looked like I was rejecting Brandon's attempt to help me, confirming their belief in my guilt and his innocence. Dad, please, you have to listen to me. I found evidence that Brandon has been stealing money for 2 years. He's been skimming client deposits. The Morrison account, Riverside Medical, Henderson Industries. All the deposit money is gone. Dad's face went white. What are you talking about? Those deposits are in our business account. Brandon moved smoothly to the computer on Dad's desk. Actually, Dad, this is the hardest part to tell you. Timothy has been moving deposit money into his personal accounts. I've been trying to cover for him by moving money from our reserves, but we're running out of cushion. Brandon pulled up bank records on the computer screen. See? The Henderson deposit came in 6 weeks ago, but it was transferred out the same day. Same with Riverside Medical. Timothy's been taking deposit money and gambling that he could replace it before the project started. That's impossible, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. Those deposits should still be in the business account. They should be, Dad agreed, his voice hollow. But according to these records, they're not. Mom collapsed back into her chair, sobbing openly now. How could you gamble with your father's business? How could you risk everything he's built? I haven't gambled anything. I haven't taken any money. Brandon is lying to cover up his own theft. Enough! Dad's voice cracked like a whip. I've heard enough lies. The evidence is clear, Timothy. Your signatures, your accounts, your theft of money that was supposed to fund 3 major projects. Dad walked around his desk to face me directly. You're banned from company property effective immediately. Your access to all accounts is revoked. Your company credit cards are canceled. You are no longer employed by Sullivan Construction. Dad, please, just listen to me for 5 minutes. I don't want to hear another word from you, unless it's a full confession and a plan to return every penny you've stolen. Brandon stepped forward again, his face a picture of brotherly concern. Timothy, this doesn't have to destroy the family. If you confess now and work with us to return the money, we can handle this privately. No police, no public humiliation, just restitution and therapy to help you deal with whatever drove you to this. The offer sounded reasonable, even generous. To my parents, it probably looked like Brandon was trying to save me from criminal prosecution despite my betrayal of the family trust. I'm not confessing to crimes I didn't commit. Mom looked at me like I was a stranger. Then you're not the son I raised. The Timothy I raised would take responsibility for his mistakes and try to make things right. Your choice, Dad said quietly. Confess and accept the consequences like a man, or be disowned completely. You have until the end of business today to decide. I looked around the office where I had spent the last 6 years of my life, at the family photos on Dad's desk, at the company logo that represented 4 decades of honest work. Brandon had destroyed all of it with his lies, and I was powerless to prove my innocence. I'll never confess to something I didn't do. Then you're no longer my son, Dad said, his voice breaking. I walked out of Sullivan Construction that morning knowing I had lost everything. My job, my family, my reputation, and my future. Brandon watched me go with sympathetic eyes that couldn't quite hide his triumph. As I drove away from the company Dad built, I realized that Brandon's plan was even more diabolical than I had imagined. He hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen my identity, my relationships, and my place in the world. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated how far I would go to prove my innocence and expose his guilt. The war between us was just beginning. 3 days later, I sat in the cramped office of Marcus Webb, private investigator, watching him review the evidence I had brought. Marcus was a former police detective in his 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. His office smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and the walls were covered with certificates and photos from his law enforcement days. "This is sophisticated work," Marcus said, studying the forged signatures. "Your brother didn't just steal money. He conducted a systematic identity theft operation against you. These bank accounts, the signature cards, even the credit applications, they're all meticulously crafted. Can you prove that I didn't create them? Give me 2 weeks and $1,500, and I'll give you enough evidence to clear your name and put your brother in prison." I wrote Marcus a check that cleaned out my savings account, money I had been saving for Sarah's engagement ring. It felt like investing in my only chance at redemption. Marcus proved to be worth every penny. Within 48 hours, he had traced the fake accounts to their origins. Brandon had opened them using stolen information, including my social security number and copies of my driver's license. Security cameras from the bank showed Brandon signing paperwork under my name. But Marcus's investigation revealed something far worse than I had imagined. Brandon hadn't stopped stealing after our confrontation. He was escalating, moving deposit money from 3 major upcoming projects into offshore accounts at an alarming rate. "Your brother has stolen over $200,000, Marcus informed me during our second meeting. "And according to bank transfer records, he's planning to move another $100,000 by Friday. Projects that start construction next week," I said, feeling sick. "Right. When those clients realize their deposit money is gone, they'll demand immediate refunds or file lawsuits. Your father's company will face financial ruin within 30 days. The scope of Brandon's betrayal was breathtaking. He wasn't just stealing money. He was systematically destroying everything Dad had built. The company would face multiple lawsuits, bankruptcy proceedings, and the loss of reputation that would make future business impossible. "There's more," Marcus continued. "I found evidence that your brother has been planning this for over 2 years. Costa Rica was always the endgame. He's been positioning himself as the victim of your supposed theft while moving money offshore and preparing false identity documents. That same evening, Dad suffered what doctors called a mild heart attack. Mom called to let me know, her voice cold and distant, making it clear that I wasn't welcome at the hospital. Your father collapsed at work," she said. "The stress of your betrayal has been too much for him. I hope you're satisfied with what you've done to this family." I drove to County General anyway, hoping to see Dad and maybe find a way to talk to him privately. Instead, I found Brandon holding court in the waiting room, surrounded by family, friends, and business associates who were offering their support during this difficult time. "Timothy," Brandon said when he saw me, his voice carrying just the right mix of surprise and concern. "I didn't expect to see you here." The assembled crowd turned to look at me, and I saw my reputation reflected in their faces. I was no longer Timothy Sullivan, reliable son and hard-working construction supervisor. I was the family disgrace, the son who had stolen from his own father and caused his heart attack. "How is he?" I asked. "Stable," Brandon replied. "But the doctors say stress was a major factor. Dad's been losing sleep over the missing money, trying to figure out how to cover the client deposits that you stole." Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store shook her head sadly. "I can't believe it, Timothy. Your father is such a good man. How could you do this to him?" I wanted to scream the truth, to tell everyone that Brandon was the thief and I was his victim. But surrounded by people who had already judged me guilty, I knew my words would only sound like desperate lies. "I just wanted to check on him," I said quietly. "Maybe it's better if you don't visit," Brandon suggested gently. "The last thing Dad needs right now is more stress." I left the hospital feeling more isolated than ever. Even Sarah was starting to doubt me. Her parents had heard the rumors circulating around town, and they were pressuring her to end our relationship. "My dad thinks you're a criminal," Sarah told me that night as we sat in my apartment. "My mom is worried that I'll be dragged down with you if this gets worse." "Do you believe them?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you didn't steal that money. But Timothy, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Even if you're innocent, how are you going to prove it? Your brother has convinced everyone that you're guilty. Marcus is building a case. He's found evidence that Brandon created those accounts using my stolen information. And what happens if it's not enough? What happens if Brandon's lies are more convincing than Marcus's evidence?" I didn't have an answer for that question, and Sarah's doubt cut deeper than any knife. The next day brought worse news. Marcus called with information that made my blood run cold. "Your brother is moving faster than I expected. He's scheduled to transfer the remaining client deposits tonight, $200,000, gone by morning. And there's something else you need to know." "What?" "I intercepted communications between your brother and a contact in Costa Rica. He's not just planning to disappear with the money. He's planning to frame you for drug trafficking as well." "What are you talking about?" "He's arranged for cocaine to be planted in your apartment. The plan is to call in an anonymous tip to police after he's safely out of the country. You'll be arrested for drug trafficking, which will discredit any claims you make about his theft." The room spun around me. Brandon's plan wasn't just to steal money and frame me for embezzlement. He intended to destroy my life so completely that I would never be able to expose his crimes. "How long do we have?" "According to the communications I intercepted, the drugs will be planted tomorrow night. Police will receive the anonymous tip Friday morning, about the same time your brother's plane lands in Costa Rica." I had less than 48 hours to expose Brandon's crimes before he disappeared forever, and I was arrested for drug trafficking. The evidence Marcus had gathered was substantial, but would it be enough to convince people who had already made up their minds about my guilt? That night, I made a decision that would determine the rest of my life. I wasn't going to run, and I wasn't going to hide. I was going to confront Brandon one final time, and this time, I was going to be prepared. Marcus had given me more than just evidence. He had given me the tools to fight back. Audio recording equipment, legal documentation, and most importantly, a plan to catch Brandon in the act of his final theft. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, as we prepared our strategy. "If we miscalculate, if Brandon realizes what we're doing, you could end up in prison for crimes you didn't commit. I'd rather go to prison fighting for the truth than spend my life hiding from lies." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Then, let's catch ourselves a thief." Thursday evening, Marcus and I sat in his van outside Brandon's apartment building, monitoring the audio equipment we had planted in his living room that morning. Getting inside had been surprisingly easy. Brandon's overconfidence had made him sloppy about security. "He's moving around a lot," Marcus whispered, adjusting the receiver. "Sounds like he's packing." Through our headphones, we could hear Brandon talking on the phone, making final arrangements for his escape. His voice carried the casual confidence of someone who believed he had already won. "The transfer goes through at midnight," Brandon was saying to someone. 200,000, straight to the Cayman account. "By the time anyone realizes the money is gone, I'll be sipping rum on a beach in Costa Rica." Marcus and I exchanged glances. We were recording every word, building the evidence that would expose Brandon's crimes. But we needed more than just admissions of theft. We needed him to confess to framing me. "What about your brother?" the voice on the phone asked. Brandon laughed coldly. "Timothy won't be a problem much longer. Tomorrow night, he's going to have some unexpected visitors. 2 kilos of Colombian cocaine hidden in his apartment, and an anonymous tip to the narcotics division. Even if he somehow proves his innocence on the embezzlement charges, a drug trafficking conviction will keep him quiet for the next 15 years. My hands clenched into fists as I listened to my little brother plan my destruction with the casual efficiency of a professional criminal. "You're sure the drugs can't be traced back to you?" "The contact has no idea who I am. Cash payment, no names, no connections. Timothy's apartment gets broken into, drugs get planted, police get an anonymous call. Simple and clean." Marcus was recording everything. But I knew we needed more. Brandon was admitting to future plans, not past crimes. We needed him to confess to the systematic theft he had been conducting for 2 years. The father bought the whole story about Timothy being the embezzler? Completely. You should have seen his face when I showed him the fake bank accounts and forged signatures. He actually cried, Marcus. The great Robert Sullivan, crying over his son's betrayal. It was almost sad. And the mother? Mom's been saying for years that Timothy was jealous of me. When I told her he had finally snapped and started stealing, she believed it instantly. Timothy always was the less favorite son. The casual cruelty in Brandon's voice as he described our parents' pain made me want to storm into his apartment and beat him senseless. But Marcus put a restraining hand on my arm, reminding me that we needed to stick to the plan. How much have you stolen total? From the business? About $300,000 over 2 years. But that's just the beginning. The real money is in the client deposits. Companies like Henderson Industries and Riverside Medical don't just lose money and walk away. They sue. They destroy reputations. Dad's company will be bankrupt within 6 months. And Timothy takes the blame for all of it? Timothy takes the blame, goes to prison for drug trafficking, and disappears from my life forever. Mom and Dad lose their business, their savings, probably their house. But hey, at least they'll still have one son they can be proud of. I had heard enough. The recordings contained everything we needed: admissions of theft, detailed descriptions of the frame-up, and evidence of Brandon's plan to destroy our entire family. But Marcus held up a hand, indicating we should wait. There's one more thing I need him to address, Marcus whispered. Through our headphones, we heard Brandon's phone ring again. Yeah? Mr. Sullivan? This is Detective Rodriguez, with the Financial Crimes Unit. We need to schedule an interview regarding the embezzlement case involving your brother. My blood ran cold. The police were already involved, and they wanted to interview Brandon as the victim's brother and the company employee who had discovered the theft. Of course, Detective. I've been expecting your call. When would be convenient? Tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. We'll need you to walk us through how you discovered your brother's crimes and what evidence you've collected. I'll be there, Detective. I have extensive documentation of Timothy's theft patterns, bank records, forged signatures, everything you'll need to build a solid case. After Brandon hung up, we heard him talking to himself as he continued packing. Perfect timing. By the time the police realize they've been chasing the wrong suspect, I'll be long gone, and Timothy will be in custody for drug trafficking. The beautiful thing about this plan is that everyone wins except Timothy. The cops get their criminal, Mom and Dad get closure, and I get a new life in paradise. Marcus finally gave me the signal. We had everything we needed on tape, but now we had to move quickly. Brandon was scheduled to meet with police tomorrow afternoon, which meant he would deliver his final lies to law enforcement in less than 18 hours. We need to get to the FBI field office tonight, Marcus said as we packed up the surveillance equipment. Financial crimes involving interstate transfers and false identity documents fall under federal jurisdiction. Will they believe us? They'll believe the recordings. And I've got a contact in the bureau who owes me a favor from my police days. Special Agent Karen Martinez. She's smart, thorough, and she hates white-collar criminals who prey on their own families. We drove to the federal building in downtown Cleveland, where Agent Martinez met us in her office despite the late hour. She was a woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes, and the kind of focused intensity that made criminals nervous. Marcus played the recordings while I provided background on Sullivan Construction and the family dynamics that had allowed Brandon to operate undetected for so long. Agent Martinez listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is substantial evidence," she said when the recordings finished. "But we need to catch him in the act of transferring the money. Bank records showing past transfers aren't enough. We need him committing a crime in real time." "The transfer is scheduled for midnight," I said. "He's moving $200,000 from client deposit accounts to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. That gives us 3 hours to set up surveillance and coordinate with the Financial Crimes Task Force. Mr. Sullivan, are you willing to cooperate with an FBI investigation? I'll do whatever it takes to stop him." Agent Martinez smiled grimly. Then, let's catch ourselves a white-collar criminal. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. FBI agents coordinated with the bank to monitor Brandon's accounts. Technical specialists prepared to trace the electronic transfers in real time. And I provided detailed information about Brandon's methods, motivations, and timeline. At 11:45 p.m., we watched from an FBI surveillance van as Brandon initiated the transfer from his laptop in his apartment. The money moved electronically from Sullivan Construction's accounts to a series of shell companies before landing in the Cayman Islands account he had prepared. Got him, Agent Martinez said as the final transfer completed. $200,000 in client funds moved to personal accounts in a foreign jurisdiction. That's wire fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal banking regulations. But Brandon had one final surprise for us. At 12:15 a.m., we watched him leave his apartment carrying a single duffel bag, instead of the multiple suitcases we had expected. He's not going to the airport, Marcus observed as we followed Brandon's car through the empty streets. Instead, Brandon drove to a 24-hour storage facility on the outskirts of town. Using night vision equipment, we watched him enter a storage unit and emerge with 2 large backpacks and what appeared to be a briefcase. Cash, Agent Martinez said grimly. He's been converting stolen money to cash for months, storing it off-site to avoid detection. We followed Brandon to a small private airfield where a chartered plane waited on the tarmac. As he approached the aircraft, FBI agents moved in from all directions. FBI, stop where you are. Brandon dropped his bags and raised his hands, but his expression wasn't one of surprise or fear. He looked like someone whose carefully laid plans had been disrupted, but not defeated. I want to speak to my attorney, he said calmly, as handcuffs were placed around his wrists. You'll have that opportunity, Agent Martinez replied. Right after we search your bags and ask you about the $300,000 you've stolen from your family's business. As Brandon was led away to a waiting FBI vehicle, Agent Martinez turned to me with satisfaction. Mr. Sullivan, your brother is facing federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit drug trafficking. Based on the evidence we've collected tonight, he's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. I watched the taillights of the FBI car disappear into the night, carrying Brandon toward the justice he had been running from for 2 years. But I knew the hardest part was still ahead, convincing my family that the son they had trusted was guilty and the son they had disowned was innocent. The war between Brandon and me was over. Now came the even more difficult battle to rebuild the family he had nearly destroyed. 6 months later, I stood in the same courtroom where this story began, but this time as a witness for the prosecution rather than as the accused. Brandon sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, flanked by 2 public defenders who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison, had built an airtight case using the evidence Marcus and I had gathered. Bank records, audio recordings, forged documents, and testimony from FBI agents painted a picture of systematic fraud that left no room for doubt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Morrison said during her closing argument, the defendant, Brandon Sullivan, didn't just steal money from his family's business. He conducted a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to destroy his own brother's life and reputation, while enriching himself with funds intended for legitimate construction projects. Brandon's defense had tried to resurrect his original story about me being the real thief, but the evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showed him opening fake bank accounts using my stolen information. Audio recordings captured him confessing to the frame-up. Financial records traced every dollar from Sullivan Construction to his personal accounts. When the jury returned their verdict after less than 2 hours of deliberation, Brandon remained perfectly still as the foreman read guilty on all counts: wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, conspiracy to commit drug trafficking, and racketeering. The defendant will be remanded into custody pending sentencing, Judge Patricia Williams announced. Sentencing is scheduled for 4 weeks from today. As Brandon was led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one final time. For a moment, I saw not the calculating criminal he had become, but the little brother I had once protected from schoolyard bullies. Then the moment passed, and he was just another convicted felon being taken to federal prison. Mom sat in the gallery behind me, tears streaming down her face. The revelation of Brandon's guilt had shattered her world completely. For 6 months, she had been forced to confront the reality that her golden child was a criminal and the son she had disowned was innocent. "I'm sorry, Timothy," she whispered, as we left the courthouse together. "I'm so sorry for not believing you." The apology was a start, but rebuilding our relationship would take years. Mom had to come to terms with the fact that her favoritism had enabled Brandon's crimes and nearly destroyed an innocent son. She started therapy 2 weeks after Brandon's arrest, working to understand how her need to see Brandon as perfect had blinded her to his true nature. Dad waited for us outside the courthouse, looking older but somehow more at peace than he had in months. The stress of the investigation and trial had taken its toll, but knowing the truth had lifted a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "Justice was served today," Dad said simply. "Brandon will have 6 years to think about what he did to this family." 6 years. The sentence Judge Williams had imposed was less than the maximum 20 years Brandon could have received, but the prosecution had agreed to the reduction in exchange for his cooperation in recovering the stolen funds. Most of the money had been returned to Sullivan Construction, allowing the company to survive and eventually thrive. The real healing had begun months before the trial ended. 3 weeks after Brandon's arrest, Dad came to my apartment with an offer that changed everything. "I want you to come back to Sullivan Construction," he said. "Not as an employee, Timothy, as my partner. 50-50 ownership, equal say in all decisions, your name on the door next to mine." "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. I failed you in the worst possible way. I believed Brandon's lies instead of trusting the son who had never given me reason to doubt him. Sullivan Construction needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, with new systems, new oversight, and new leadership. I can't do it alone." Working together to save the family business had been therapeutic for both of us. We implemented new financial controls, hired an internal accountant, and established oversight procedures that would prevent future embezzlement. More importantly, we learned to communicate honestly with each other for the first time in our lives. Sarah had stood by me throughout the entire ordeal, despite pressure from her family and friends to distance herself from the scandal. Her faith in my innocence, even when the evidence seemed overwhelming, had given me strength to continue fighting. "I never doubted you," she told me on the day Brandon was sentenced. "I knew the Timothy I loved wasn't capable of stealing from his own family." I proposed to her 3 months after Brandon's conviction, using the engagement ring fund I had rebuilt through my partnership in Sullivan Construction. She said yes while we sat on the dock at Lake Erie, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and orange. The community response had been mixed, but ultimately supportive. Some people apologized for believing Brandon's lies about me. Others quietly accepted that they had misjudged the situation, but never explicitly acknowledged their mistake. A few stubborn holdouts continued to whisper that maybe I had been involved somehow, but their voices grew fewer and less influential over time. Marcus Webb became more than just the private investigator who had saved my life. He became a close friend, and eventually Sullivan Construction's security consultant, helping us design systems to prevent future financial crimes. His experience with white-collar criminals had taught him that family businesses were particularly vulnerable to insider theft. "The people who can hurt you most are the ones you trust completely," Marcus told me, during one of our regular dinners together. Brandon exploited that trust more skillfully than most professional con artists. Brandon served 3 years of his 6-year sentence before being released on parole. He wrote me a letter from prison, asking for forgiveness and expressing remorse for what he had done to our family. The letter seemed sincere, but I wasn't ready to respond. Some wounds need time to heal before forgiveness becomes possible. Mom struggled the most with Brandon's conviction and imprisonment. Her identity as the mother of a successful, charming son had been central to how she saw herself. Learning that Brandon was actually a criminal who had systematically manipulated her love and trust required her to rebuild her understanding of herself and her family. I enabled him, she admitted during one of our monthly dinners together. I made excuses for his behavior, covered for his mistakes, and convinced myself that he could do no wrong. I created a monster, and then blamed you when the monster showed its true nature. You loved him, Mom. That's not a crime. Love without boundaries isn't love, she replied, echoing something her therapist had taught her. It's enabling. I'm learning to love both my sons without trying to make either of you perfect. Sullivan Construction not only survived Brandon's theft, but thrived under our new partnership structure. The transparency and accountability measures we implemented attracted clients who valued ethical business practices. Our reputation for honest dealing, once damaged by the scandal, became stronger than ever. 5 years after Brandon's sentencing, Sullivan Construction employed 68 people and generated over $5 million annually. We had expanded into 3 new markets and earned recognition as one of the most trusted construction companies in Ohio. Dad formally retired on his 70th birthday, leaving me as the sole owner of the business he had built from nothing. At the retirement party, he gave a speech that brought tears to my eyes. I built this company with my hands and my sweat, he said to the assembled employees and clients. But I'm leaving it in much better hands than mine. Timothy has shown me what true integrity looks like, even when that integrity came at great personal cost. Sullivan Construction will thrive under his leadership because he understands something I had to learn the hard way. Character matters more than profit. Sarah and I married 2 years after Brandon's conviction, in a small ceremony at the church where my parents had been married 40 years earlier. Brandon was still in prison and couldn't attend, but his absence felt appropriate rather than tragic. We were building a new family based on honesty and mutual respect, values that Brandon had rejected in favor of greed and selfishness. Our first child, Robert Timothy Sullivan, was born 3 years later. We named him after Dad, but I made sure he understood that carrying a family name meant upholding family values. I never wanted him to feel the pressure to be perfect that had driven Brandon to crime, but I also wanted him to understand that choices have consequences. The deepest healing came through an unexpected source: volunteer work with families affected by white-collar crime. Marcus introduced me to a support group for victims of financial fraud, and I discovered that my story was far from unique. Countless families had been destroyed by trusted relatives who had stolen money, betrayed confidences, and manipulated love for criminal purposes. The hardest part isn't losing the money, one woman told me during a group meeting. It's losing your ability to trust the people you love. When your own brother steals from you, how do you ever feel safe again? I understood her pain completely. Brandon's betrayal had damaged more than just bank accounts. It had shattered my fundamental belief that family members would protect each other rather than prey on each other. But I also learned that healing was possible. Slowly, carefully, with appropriate boundaries and honest communication, trust could be rebuilt. Not the blind trust I had once given Brandon, but a mature understanding that love requires accountability and that protecting someone sometimes means holding them responsible for their actions. The life lesson that emerged from this nightmare was simple but profound. True family loyalty means having the courage to do what's right, even when it's painful. Enabling destructive behavior isn't love. It's cowardice disguised as compassion. Real love requires the strength to say no, to set boundaries, and to hold people accountable for their choices. If I had quietly covered for Brandon's initial theft, if I had chosen family peace over family integrity, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The business would have been destroyed, innocent employees would have lost their jobs, and Brandon would have continued stealing until he faced even more serious criminal charges. By refusing to enable his behavior, by insisting on truth, even when that truth was painful, I had saved my family from complete destruction. The cost was high, the process was agonizing, but the alternative would have been total ruin. Today, Sullivan Construction stands stronger than ever, built on a foundation of honesty and accountability, rather than blind trust and wishful thinking. Dad enjoys a comfortable retirement, knowing that his life's work will continue with integrity. Mom has learned to love without enabling, setting healthy boundaries that protect everyone involved. And I wake up every morning knowing that I chose truth over comfort, integrity over peace, and justice over family loyalty. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, and it saved everything that truly mattered. The gavel that crashed down 6 months ago didn't just sentence Brandon to prison. It freed our family from the lies that had been slowly poisoning us for years. Justice wasn't just served, it was transformative. Sometimes, love requires the courage to hold people accountable, even when they're family. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. Sometimes saving the people you love means having the strength to let them face the consequences of their choices. Brandon taught me that blood isn't thicker than honesty, and that true family loyalty means protecting what's right, not protecting who's wrong. It's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life, and it's one I'll teach my children. Character matters more than comfort, and truth matters more than peace. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? It's one of the hardest decisions anyone can face, but it's also one of the most important. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might benefit from understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to cover for someone's destructive choices. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that integrity is always worth fighting for, even when the fight feels impossible to win.